Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to see this morning what life was like at King's College, Babylon. Or should I say Imperial College? So we're going to read some verses again from chapter 1. And we're going to begin in verse 5. The king, that is Nebuchadnezzar, assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of all the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Nebuchadnezzar was an enlightened genius, and he chose the brightest people in the nations that he had conquered and trained them. It was a very shrewd thing to do, to use the people who knew the ground, but to give them a top quality education in your administration. It was a broad education involving not only the necessary language training, but it had a very strong cultural element. The students were exposed to Babylonian literature. And Daniel and his friends didn't refuse this education. Of course, they'd no option. But they were clearly not men whose concept of God impelled them into a ghetto. Their concept of God impelled them to be out there, the rough and tumble of society, and yet to maintain their integrity as believers. The scholarship system was very good too. No top-up grants for Babylon, but 3 years' study. I wonder if Oxford and Cambridge got the idea from there. Board and lodging, full board indeed, of the very highest quality, supplied by the royal caterers themselves. And I can imagine once they got over the shock of the traumatic ripping away from their own families, I can imagine that Daniel and his friends found it increasingly exciting. After all, here they were studying in the best university in the world. They were studying law and administration in the country that had developed the Code of Hammurabi, the earliest legal code known to us in its entirety, going back to around 2050 BC. A legal code that was impressive for its humaneness. It sought, for instance, to protect the weak being exploited by the rich and powerful. What an opportunity to engage with the culture. And I suspect it was with an increasing sensation of being placed in a unique position by God that these four men entered with vigor into their studies. What an opportunity it is to study. I was the first in my family to get the chance. And it was daunting to go from Armagh to Cambridge, but it was very exciting. To leave a monotheistic culture, as Ulster was in those days, to enter into the pluralism of Cambridge, only a faint shadow of what Daniel had to face. Nevertheless, there are similarities. And getting to that university and finding that immediately my faith was being questioned. First week at college, do you believe in God? Oh, sorry, you're Irish. They all believe in God there. They fight about it. And so I was faced with a question. Was my faith simply a product of my culture? Daniel was faced with that question, and so were his friends. Tiny little nation Judah was at the time. And here's the vast world empire with all it had to offer intellectually. How could they possibly be right? And they were in that university to study the ideas that shaped culture and history. Because as we all know, ideas have consequences. What is generated in the university today will be in the press tomorrow and subtly in your brain not long after that. Often unnoticed, like a virus of the mind. Until we register, perhaps too late, the drift that is already occurring in our own thinking and behavior. Daniel and his friends went for the education, but simultaneously they were committed to withstanding the drift. Let's imagine the kind of conversation that might have happened when Daniel and his friends started meeting the other students at dinner. What's your name? Oh, my name's Daniel. Daniel? That's an unusual name. I've never heard it before. What linguistic group does it belong to? Hebrew, said Daniel. Oh, really? You mean you're one of that tiny little nation that Nebuchadnezzar captured the other week? Well, I'm sorry for you. I've seen some of the artifacts down in the museum. They're pretty impressive, but they're not very many, are they? But tell me, it sounds Semitic, your name. Does it have a meaning like our names have? Well, it does actually. It means God is my judge. Pardon? God is your judge. Tell me, do you seriously mean that's your concept of God? That he is your judge? How very boring and grim. Also sounds as if you don't have much fun, Daniel. If you go around thinking that God is looking at you over your shoulder and stopping your fun whenever it comes up. How boring. Do you know, you're going to get to realize that it's not like that here in Babylon. We have endless gods, and our gods are clearly superior to yours. Otherwise, your little country would have won. We beat you, didn't we? And our temples are far more fun than yours too. We don't cramp our style by thinking there are any absolutes like God out there. We believe the gods are deep in every human experience. Sex is one of the best, actually. Why don't you come to one of our temples tonight and you'll see what we get up to when the goddess gets into us. There'll be lots of us there, lots of girls to go round, and you'll see why our gods are better than yours. We don't use the same language today, do we? The language of the gods. But all the rest is the same. And the pressure's the same. And you can imagine Mishael now coming into the discussion and explaining his name. Do you know, my name is a meaning too. Mishael, who is like the Lord is. And my name reminds me that there's only one God. Our view of the universe is totally different from you Babylonians. You believe in a whole lot of gods, but there's only one God, creator of heaven and earth, not a group of petty warring gods like you Babylonians believe in, who simply behave like humans, only worse. Can't you see what you're doing? Because you no real idea of the uniqueness of God and his separateness from creation. You're turning the creation into God. God has made sex. Of course he has. It's a marvelous thing. But he's also made, the one true God has, human beings in his image. We are moral beings. And precisely because God has made us in his image as moral beings, our sexuality and the way we use it matters. God is the author of joy. He's told us the right way to live. And he says we're going to get the best enjoyment out of our relationships and our sexuality if we confine it to marriage. Don't you see that turning sex into a goddess actually devalues your humanness? Those girls you're going to sleep with tonight, aren't you just using them as a commodity to be eventually discarded? What sort of value system is that? Don't you believe in a higher value for humans than that? And Daniel might break in again and say, you find it amusing that my name means God is my judge, but think about it. We're studying law, all of us. We believe in justice. But we live in a world where not everybody gets justice, do they? Some tyrants get away with the most incredible cruelty. Life deals out a very unfair hand to many people. And if there isn't a God who will ultimately judge this world, then you're studying law in a university, but you really believe that your sense of justice is an illusion. You can see the conversation hotting up a bit, can't you, on this first evening in King's College, Babylon. And you can see Hananiah, who's bursting to speak, on the edge saying, hey, hang on a bit, Daniel. We ought to balance this out a little. My name means something too. My name tells me that God is a God of grace. Don't get us wrong, we believe in a God of justice. But none of us here are claiming to be perfect. Our God, who's perfectly just, is also a God of mercy, and each of us four have known his forgiveness. And you can see the Babylonians beginning to wrestle with these new ideas. And then Azariah, who's been patiently waiting on the edge, says, I want to bring this right back down to earth. Do you want to know what my name means? It means the Lord helps. You see, we believe that there's one true God. Do you know why we believe it? Not only because it is a theoretical construct that answers our intellectual quest for logic and satisfaction and order. It's because God is real in our experience. Real in your experience? And you say that after your little country has been beaten up and you've been ripped away from your parents. Yes, says Azariah, real in our experience. Because our God told us that this is exactly what would happen to us if we messed up and started compromising with the ideology that you people believe. Well, there was the basis for a good discussion, wasn't it? But you will have noticed that those four names in themselves carry with them what we would call the gospel, the good news. Their names were a powerful witness to what they believed about God. But Nebuchadnezzar had appointed one of his senior people to be in charge of the students. He presumably was what we would call at Oxford an admissions officer. He was the person who decided who to take and who to leave, and I am involved in such commissions at the university, trying to sift out the really good ones, the ones that deserve to come. And so he'd chosen these four amongst many others. And the first thing he did was to give them Babylonian names. Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. Why did this happen? Well, it was a clear attempt at homogenization, at cultural assimilation, to remove, at least superficially, their distinctiveness that would draw attention to what they at heart believed. By changing their names, the university authorities were attempting, unsuccessfully, as we're going to see, to remove their identities, which bore witness to God. They weren't going to get the easy opportunity that I've just outlined to you, to use the meaning of their names to witness to their living faith in God and the reality of their experience in Him. So, they deliberately called Daniel Belteshazzar, after their supreme god Bel-Marduk. The new name may have meant, may Bel protect him, or possibly, and very interestingly, treasurer of Bel. Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach, which means command of Aku, the moon god. And Mishael came off worst of all, because he had his name changed to Meshach, and it sounds very similar to Mishael, and that is deliberate, because it was a parody of his Hebrew name. Instead of who is like El, that is, who is like God, it was who is like Aku, the moon god. That was tough. And Azariah became Abednego, which means servant of Nabu. And Nabu was the god who was the son of the chief god Marduk. It was an example, a blatant example of what we now call cultural engineering. An attempt to smooth out the potential awkward lumps in society by making everyone the same. Precisely the kind of thing that George Orwell talks about in his book 1984. It was an early attempt to level identities, to reduce everybody to the same in the interests of keeping the nation united. Let's think about it for a moment. It happened not in New York, Beijing, or London. It happened in Babylon, or Babel, as it was originally called, the name meaning the gate of God. And the Bible thinks that the origin of this city is so important that we should know about it. And if you go back to Genesis 11, you will discover that the very motivation for building the city and the famous tower or ziggurat at Babel was this: let us make a name for ourselves, that we should not be scattered in the earth. The building of that ancient city was motivated by the restless human search for meaning and identity. I can understand that, can't you? I want to have meaning and identity. I want to know who I am, don't you? And it's not always easy, is it, to discover who we are? For many, it can be a real struggle. Have you ever wished to be someone else, somewhere else, sometime else? And as you look over the catalogue of what has been life, do you sometimes think God may have made a mistake, if there is a God, in making you you? How do we go about finding identity that fills us with meaning? Because with all our technology, with all our sophistication, and we're as feverishly intellectually and technologically and scientifically active as they were in Babel, it still leaves a profound emptiness in the human heart. And we long for deeper meaning. And some of us who've been Christians for many years are still longing for that satisfaction. Babel, let us make a name for ourselves. Where do names come from? Daniel was in the university. He had to master a new language. He had to learn how to name things in a language he hadn't known as a boy. The phenomenon of language is a fascinating thing. I'm thankful to a brilliant teacher at the school I went to in Armagh who awakened a deep love for languages. God commanded human beings to name the animals, didn't he? He started science. It's a division of biology called taxonomy, naming animals. But of course, naming things is part of every discipline, as you know. If you learn nursing, you have to learn lots of medical names that I wouldn't know. Engineering, business. Every area has its names, its special words. Because learning to name things in a real sense means we're gaining a certain understanding of them and a mastery over them. And we do most of it. It's part of the sheer fun of science, of course. But what about man himself? I mean, the word man and the word woman, where did that come from? Isn't it striking that the Bible tells us that he didn't name himself? Named all the other animals, but not himself or herself. Why was that? God gave the name man and the name woman. And in that book of origins, Genesis, which is talking about the importance of language and its development, the fascinating thing is that man was told to name everything else, but there are just a few bits of the universe that God decided to name himself. And one of them is you. A man or a woman. What's that saying? It's saying that the concept of man and woman over against the concept of the animals is so important, that distinction, that we need to grasp that our name ultimately came from God. Say, that's swimming against the contemporary intellectual current, isn't it? Who are you? It makes a vast difference to your concept of yourself as a human being. Whether you believe that you're simply the product, like everything else is believed to be, of chance, mindless, unguided processes, or are you something special, made in the image of God? God made man and woman in his own image, personal moral beings with the capacity for a relationship with God. And through that relationship, which was a word relationship, God spoke to them. They were given the facility of language so that they could dialogue with God, and that defined their life at its highest part and gave them an identity. And when people lose that sense of the reality of God and stop speaking with him and he with them, they begin to descend into meaninglessness. Can happen even to Christians, can't it? When we lose the sense that God is real and that God speaks. That's what defines me. In the end, you see, we can use, and I do, as you know, all the arguments that I could possibly get a hold of to buttress my faith. But in the end, in the final analysis, if God does not speak with an authoritative voice through his word, then I would be of all men most miserable. Because that in the end is what authenticates the whole business to me. That God speaks and knows my name. But in Babel they had discarded that. They were determined to be self-created men and women, to create their own identity, to make their own name by their own intellectual ability, leaving God out. And that is the way of the world, isn't it? And God put a stop to it in that ancient world and slowed up their ability to name things by confusing their language. And it was because of that event in ancient history that Daniel is now sitting in his study in Babylon having to learn the language. It's fun learning languages, but I sometimes wish I hadn't to. But God was determined to mess up their capacity to communicate. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Babylon didn't have the right foundations. Oh, I know it had a big tower and was brilliant engineering. And it was a clever combination of various kinds of chemicals and building materials. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about its ideology, what it stood for in the ancient world. And it stood for a combination of human genius and drive to create an identity. And that drive is what's pushing so many leaders in our world today and so many individuals. But there's another way to live. In the very next chapter of Genesis, God speaks to a man whose name then was Abram, who lived in Ur, which was not far from Babel. And he called him to leave his homeland and travel to another land. And the New Testament tells us more about his fundamental motivation and says that Abraham was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He left one kind of city to move not to nothing, but to another kind of city. So the Bible, ladies and gentlemen, is a tale of two cities. And those two cities come barreling up through Scripture, and you discover both of them in the book of Revelation: Babylon and Jerusalem. That city that Abram looked for, one of the important things about it is that it has foundations. Its designer and builder is God, and they're not thinking of steel and concrete. The writer is thinking of the foundational principles that Abraham learned. The main foundation of Babylon was trust in the human mind and in human ability. Let's make a name for ourselves. The basic principle of the city that Abram looked for is trust in God. Let's listen to what God said to Abraham as he started out. He said, Abraham, I want you to come to me because I'm already outside that civilization. And I want to tell you something. I will make your name great. So now, here are the two ways to live. The one is that I'm trying at this very moment, restlessly, to carve out a name and an identity for myself. Or else, I learn to be content with the identity that God gives me. And here we come to one of the deep and powerful secrets of Daniel's inner stability and power to be a witness to God. Not for him the creation of his own identity, so that he would have to push down the other little men that got in his way as he rose. Daniel was prepared to leave that to God. And sometimes, you know, there can be a real battle, can't there, in our hearts and minds to accept this. These aren't easy things. Why am I me? You look round and you see other people with better abilities, better talents, an ease of personality that you don't know, and why am I me? And as I speak to you this morning, I see another scene far away, both in time and space. And I'd once been talking about some similar things, and as I came to a stop, I noticed a young woman walking very slowly up to the front. And just as I finished, she turned round and raised her head to the audience. She was beautiful. At least half of her face was. Beautiful. The other half was a mass of disfigurement. And very quietly, as she looked at us, she said, I want to say publicly for the first time in my life that with all my struggle, I think I can now accept that God didn't make a mistake in making me like this. She wasn't being a fatalist. She'd come to something deep. And I tell you, that room, including myself, we wept. Oh, she'd gone a long way in her faith, hadn't she? Have you got there? Have you? Where are you in life? You know, acceptance is one of the deepest things in life, isn't it? What a strength it's been to me to have someone like Sally there who's stood by my side for 40 years and accepted me the way I am and helped improve me. That depth of relationship, I find it's rare in this world. Young men and young women, as you look out in life, and as you think of deep relationships and satisfaction at that level, make sure you get someone who's going to increase your potential to be a man or a woman of God and not hinder you, who'll help you discover meaning in your life, who'll help you develop. And yet the sadness is I meet men and women in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s. Oh, they're Christians. They go to church. But they've long since ceased praying with each other. And God has gone dead in their families. No wonder that their witness is all over the place. Because their religiosity is simply a facade. There's nothing real. It's empty. It's a shell. It's disintegrated long ago. And only the show is left. It happens very easily. I've no right to throw stones at anybody else. But we want to be real, ladies and gentlemen, because either these things are real or they're not. And if they're not real, we might as well pack up and go home. And if you're feeling this morning a lack of acceptance, feeling that the others seem to be so much better than you, so much more talented, so much more acceptable, we need to get the meaning of some of these names into our hearts, don't we? Particularly Hananiah, God and his grace. You see, the thing that's valuable about you is your meaning to God. People can reject you. They can be fickle in their attitude towards you. Thank God for people that love us and are friendly and are with us. But in the end, true stability has to do with God. The Babylonians changed Daniel's name and the others in the superficial sense, but they did not change his identity. They couldn't stop the names that they were given, but they could stop Babylon getting into their hearts and changing their inner identity and character. For, just like Abram before him, Daniel looked for the city whose designer and builder is God. And although he lived with his friends in Babylon, the secret of their life was they never lived for Babylon. You can't help the city you live in or the world you live in, but you can help the world you live for. And the whole point of this book, as I understand it, is precisely that, to show us how to live for another world that's more real than this one. And because Daniel never lost his identity as a man committed to living for God, you will find in this book that even after the Babylonian Empire had perished, his original name was not forgotten. His name may have been changed for a time, but at the end of the book, he's still called Daniel. He outlasted an empire. But then came the protest at the food in the university. He didn't maintain his faith in God, did Daniel, by becoming a hermit or a monk and running away, not at all. But that does not mean that he simply went with the flow and kept his head down. He was prepared at considerable risk to stand for God. And now we read what he did as a student. He protested that the food served up in the refectory, which students very often do. But this was good food. Indeed, the food and the wine were of the very best quality. So clearly Daniel's protest had nothing to do with its quality. Why did he protest? At this, there's no record of him protesting against the names. Perhaps he couldn't. But why choose this? Well, what we can do is see what he did and ask ourselves, are there any fundamental principles here that would apply to our own situation? Because we'll have to work out the application for ourselves. He was a Jew, was Daniel, and God had given food laws to Israel, which we find in the book of Leviticus. Those laws told the people to distinguish between different clean and unclean animals used as food sources. Secondly, they contained a prohibition against eating blood. And thirdly, the people were forbidden to eat food sacrificed to idols. And it could have been a mixture of all of those reasons. I think the most likely one is the last one, although I'm well aware that some wiser than I disagree. But I think it's very likely that it had to do with idolatry for two major reasons. Firstly, the whole Babylonian civilization was permeated with idolatry. In no other antique society, writes Georges Roux, did religion occupy such a prominent position, because in no other society did men and women feel themselves so utterly dependent on the gods. And there were 1,197 temples at that time in that city. And of course, the university would have had its own. It's impossible to imagine that the students in the university would be exempt from taking part in ceremonies where food and wine were offered to the gods. Even in Oxford today, every time I have dinner in my college, I stand up at the beginning and I say grace in Latin and acknowledge God. Traditions like that are very ancient. But my second reason for thinking it had to do with idolatry is this. It's just possible the wine was more important than the food. For what we do know from Daniel himself is that the climax of the first half of the book occurs when Belshazzar forces his nobles, his elite, to drink wine from the goblets taken from the temple in Jerusalem and to praise the gods of wood, silver, and stone as they drink. I can imagine that a sharp student like Daniel saw at once the implication of the drinking ceremonies that were part of the culture, and he saw where they would lead. Certainly tells us where they led. Wine was associated with the destruction of the Babylonian Empire. This is no innocent thing. Daniel is protesting here surely like Moses and the prophets protested before him, when they said constantly that there were things that defiled a nation. Among them, sexual immorality, perversion, injustice, idolatry. And Moses had warned, if you defile the land by your idolatry, it will vomit you out. They hadn't listened to them. And so that is what had happened. And Daniel was living at a time when, because Judah had defiled the land with her idolatry, the land had disgorged them into Babylon. And so Daniel resolved not to defile himself. He was a teenager, probably, or in his early 20s. And now in the university, he faces the issue that all of us face at every stage in life. What defiles you? What defiles you? Is it the one click away from disaster on the internet? Is it greed? Is it that facade that gets removed when you come home and anger and violence spill out to the wife and family? What defiles you? I can't answer that question for you. But all of us, ladies and gentlemen, we know, don't we? We're all under attack. And there are things that defile us. And whatever they are, this was Daniel facing it as a young man. And he saw that he'd got to make a stand. Otherwise, the moral fiber of his life would be rotten from the inside. That's tough, isn't it? But it's real. You see, we are now seeing into the heart of a man who provided one of the most powerful witnesses to God that this world has ever known. There's something behind it. It doesn't happen by accident. Daniel, of course, was not merely protesting against the physical food and wine. He was protesting against the intellectual food that was being served up and the ideology that lay behind this. The idolatrous worldview that permeated the Babylonian academy as it permeates the academy today. Because if there is no God, then ultimately the basic forces of nature are the determinators of life. We don't call them gods, but we might as well, because in the end, they're the things that shape us. Indeed, if there is no transcendent God who is a creator, the particles and energy are the things that created us. You don't get away from the idea of a creator simply by rejecting God. You will end up by endowing a part of nature with creatorial power. That is sheer idolatry. And the contemporary academy in many of its parts is not a hair's breadth away from Babylon. And Daniel believed Genesis and creation. He believed that there was a God. And he would take the education, but simultaneously he would protest at the idolatrous basis of it. He would dissociate the intellectual achievements of engineering and science and medicine and art and mathematics from the idolatry. That's a very difficult thing to do. Because our society is told in the name of science that the default position is atheism. And so what they're doing is linking the science with the ground philosophy and ideology. And now here comes the challenge, doesn't it? How can we protest against that? I can't answer for you. I try to make my own little bleats, as you know. But ladies and gentlemen, we've got to do something about it. Because if we're silent and don't engage, we're giving the impression we've nothing to say. We're giving the impression that the default position is right. I want to allow the atheist to speak, but I feel that the Christian has every right to be at the table in the discussion, because these are worldview questions. There's no default worldview in that sense. But we are going to have to increasingly stand up and be counted to get that right to the table, or the table will be closed to us. Tolerance, used to mean that I would protect your right to disagree with me. Hopefully you do it respectfully, but I'd protect your right. Tolerance has now degenerated into political correctness, where you don't say anything lest it would offend somebody. I notice the atheists are saying all they have to say without let or hindrance. It's not a level playing field, is it? And so Daniel had the courage to protest. But old Ashpenaz, the admissions officer, was frightened. And he said, "Why should Nebuchadnezzar see you looking worse? Listen, in Babylon, we pride ourselves in intellectual ability and culture. We like people who look good. And now we move from the question of identity to the question of image." Oh, that's the big pressure, isn't it? What will I look like if I protest? What are my colleagues going to think of me if I acknowledge God even in simple ways that work? And so the head goes down. The opportunity is lost. Ashpenaz says, "Look, it's more than my head's worth. Nebuchadnezzar mustn't see you looking worse. And if you go in for this believing in God stuff and refusing, you're going to look worse. It'll cripple you, men." Oh, the time just whistles by in my memory, and I see myself at Cambridge. I was 19. And I sat at dinner with a Nobel Prize winner. And he invited me and a number of professors up to his room afterwards for a cup of coffee. I was the only student. And he looked at me, and I can see him now, and he said, "Young man, do you want a career in science?" "Yes, sir." "Give up this childish nonsense of believing in God. It will only cripple you." I looked at him. I said, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I have?" And he started babbling some intellectual triviality about emergent evolution. And I left the room. I never forgot it. But that's pressure, ladies and gentlemen. That's pressure. And you all know it in your different spheres. That is if you're active. You won't know it if you're not active. The world out there is quite happy if you're silent. That's what it wants to do. It wants to lull you to sleep. And Daniel said, "Give us a chance to prove ourselves." There follows one of the first controlled trials in medicine that there's been in history. Do you see how sensitive Daniel was to this man? Treated him with respect. He was a pagan, of course. Some of us need to learn that as well, don't we? So easy when you believe that you know the truth to start looking down on other people and not being sensitive to their lostness, to their confusion, to their questions. But Daniel was. And he gave the man space to think. And he said, "You put us to the test and see." He was less than 20, you know. He didn't know a fraction of what some of you know about the Bible and theology and everything else. Not a fraction. But he knew God. And so the test was successful. And Daniel went on in his education. And these students turned out at the very top, and they were examined by Nebuchadnezzar. He was a very bright man. Imagine standing before the emperor of all the then world and having your final exams done orally. And he discovered that these young men were 10 times better than anybody else. And we read that God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Yes, we read that God gave them that skill and learning. That's what happened to them. It won't necessarily happen to me or to you. But that doesn't mean that we're not all special. These particular gifts, for this particular purpose. Because these were men who were going to bear God's name at a very high level, and they needed that kind of a training. Not everybody does. The crucial thing is that we realize that God has a role for each one of us and has given us different abilities according to those roles. We are not all the same. But what we can know, whether we are brilliant like Daniel or not, is that God is for us, because the key is not our ability, but our commitment to the Lord. And here's the final danger of which I want to speak this morning. It's very easy when you've had a good education, to become an idolater, an intellectual idolater. In that you trust your mind, you trust your brain, and you use God when you get stuck. That's idolatry. True faith in God means that we trust God and we use every ability and talent that we have. So Daniel set a compass bearing in King's College, Babylon. Have a look inside your life. The compass needle spins this morning. It spins. Where's it pointing? Where are you going to go? I don't mean geographically. Where are you going to go with God? Let's pray. Father, these things are often too big for us because they drag us out into the light. Help us not to scuttle back into the dark, but to see as Daniel saw and his friends, that you are not only a God who judges, but a God of grace. Help us, Lord, each to have the courage to face ourselves and then to come and stand before the cross and see what you have done, and help us to repent and face those deep issues, and give us courage then, Lord, to turn around and to go out and not simply to maintain our devotion to you, but, Lord, to be empowered to give witness to you in our world. For the glory of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.